Again. I am going to go through a couple of different tech lessons in this next little series of videos. The first one is going to be using this grid intro file here, which I'm going to drop into Canvas and also into Slack so that you guys get it a couple of different ways. That's just an introduction to basics and going all the way through the automatic layout for grid. You don't necessarily have to work through this one at home if you don't want to. I would like for you to work through the grid site example at home though, once I get to that here in a couple of minutes. The grid intro is pretty much just the basics. It's very nuts and bolts. If you feel bored, you're welcome to work through it with me, but it's not absolutely required. It's just looking at some code. The grid site is the one that I'm going to want you to do. So I guess I'm setting myself up to say if you want to skip ahead a few videos, feel free, but I do think that these will give you a good bit of information on how grid works basically. I just went ahead and dragged this whole folder over into Atom, and I'll take a look at what we have going on here. So in each of these folders, there's a index.html and a finish.html page as per usual, a style sheet and a finished style sheet so you can see what the code should look like. And then just ignore the stuff that's in this little CSS folder here. This just sets up the basics of how the grid layout is actually going to work, so you don't need to worry about that at all. Over here in my basic, what I'm going to do is take a glance at the index.html first, and we have just a basic grid example. We have an example div. We have ULs in here that are the cards themselves, and then we have the close of the div down here. I wouldn't actually ever take necessarily a UL and then an H2 and a paragraph inside of that. This is, to be honest with you, some code that I've modified over the years from some other lessons as I've worked with it. So this isn't necessarily the way how I would do it. Don't worry too much about those details. Just keep in mind what it is we're going to be learning about grid over here. And then I'm going to go ahead and grab this index.html file from here. So it's in, again, the basics folder. And I'm going to drag it over into the Firefox Developer Edition to start it up so that because Firefox has a really nice grid inspector. So right now, these are just in a list. You can see there's nothing actually going on with them. So we're going to need to do some stuff to make them be grid items. I do not have a home printer, so you guys are going to get to see my notes over here, so you get to see the sausage being made. There's no non-awkward way to just, view part of the screen here. So what we're going to do is we're going to go ahead and set the grid property on this item over here that has a class of cards. So we have a UL over here with a class of cards. I'll pop into our style sheet, and I'm going to just use the display grid command to set the grid layout property there. And then the next thing we're going to do here is to actually define our grid columns, and then we'll define our grid rows after that. Let's go ahead and define columns to start with, and we'll use the grid template columns command that we have over here. I'm going to use 1 fraction, 1 fraction, and 1 fraction to create 3 equal width columns. Let's save that, and then we'll look back over here at the Developer Edition, refresh the page, and you can now see that there are grid columns and grid rows that are going on here. If we go into the Web Inspector, what we can see is we can actually overlay the grid on here for what this is, and the Firefox Developer Edition will tell us, hey, here's column line 1, row line 1, column line 2, 3, 4, etc. And there are negative column values and row values as well, you can see over here, but you can see, here in the Web Inspector again, I'm looking at the cards themselves. This has a grid on it that I can overlay, and I can check that or uncheck that, and I can tell it to extend out the grid lines and do some stuff stuff that we would have there. We don't have named areas, so this isn't going to display area names yet, but we can display the line numbers and stuff like that. Anyhow, so now we have a grid layout going on the site, which is great. We can tweak this around a little bit if we wanted to. Like we could do something along the lines of we could do 2 fractions here in the middle and see how that works. And then go back and refresh it and see that, we have the grid here in the center is twice the width of the other things that we have, and so on and so forth. Right now, we have this margin and padding command at the top of the page, and that's because these items are list items, so we're going to need to tweak them a little bit to get them to show up properly. There's a different way to set actual margins inside of the grid specification, which is this grid gap command. And what we're going to do is we're going to set the grid gap here to be 20 pixels. So, and you can see that there's also grid If we look at the gap command, there's also a grid column gap and a grid row gap, and those do exactly what you would assume that they do. They would set the gap between columns and the gap between rows if we wanted those to be different from one another. In this case, we're just going to set the grid gap command to 20 pixels so that we have equal amounts of space around each of these grid items here. Now we can see that we have 20 pixels here in between the grid items. So you can set those individually as well if you wanted to. Their name of these properties is also going to change from grid gap to just gap. So that we're going to change, instead of grid column gap, grid row, we're just going to change it to just gap, column gap, and row gap. So you can include both of those in your style sheet if you want to for extra backup, or just use, grid gap. It's going to continue to be supported going forward. All right, that's number one, which is just the basics. So setting the display grid, setting up the grid template columns, and we can change how those work. We can tweak them around a little bit. And then setting a grid gap. I'm going to pause there, and we'll come back to the positioning piece.